Our story begins in England, baby, where we explore a famous conspiracy that casts doubt over the murder of one of the most famous musicians of all time, John Lennon. Was his death nothing more than a shocking tragedy? Or did the US government have something to do with it? But first, in response to last month's episode, obviously, I am already aware that you knew about the Black Dahlia because this channel has obviously covered it before. It's called sarcasm. Sorry. Anyway, I'm your host, Dagula San Vicente Jr., and this is yet another episode of Hollywood Parallel Universe. Was John Lennon murdered by the CIA?
John Winston Ono Lennon was born on October 9, 1940 in Liverpool, England. In 1957, Lennon met Paul McCartney and the two would eventually form what became known as the Beatles, a rock group Britannica called the most important musical group of the second half of the 20th century.
Now, I had never heard of the Beatles either before this, but I took a listen and they're pretty good.
John Lennon and Paul McCartney would eventually be joined by George Harrison and Ringo Starr. Together, this Fab Four would release 21 studio albums over the course of 7 years, forever changing the fabric of music. Of the four, John Lennon was the most outspoken. Throughout the 1960s, he was known to attend various political protests and happenings. He also infamously landed the Beatles in international controversy when he stated that they were even more popular than Jesus. Like every member of the Beatles, Lennon was also public about his use of LSD, which inspired lyrics in songs like I Am the Walrus and even the album Revolver. In 1970, the Beatles sent shockwaves around the world when Paul McCartney announced that he had quit the Beatles. The world's most famous band was officially kaput. John Lennon, recently married to Yoko Ono, went on to pursue other more experimental musical projects, releasing solo albums like Plastic Ono Band in 1970 and Imagine in 1971. Lennon also continued to cause controversy on a national scale, some warranted and some not. In 1969 and 1970, the crimes of Charles Manson cast a shadow over all members of the Beatles when he cited their White Album as inspiration behind his crime spree, to which Lennon responded by saying, "It has nothing to do with me." When Lennon's song Imagine was released in 1971, it was deemed to be anti-religious and anti-American for lyrics like, "Imagine there's no heaven," and "Imagine there's no countries." Lennon was also known to be an absent father to his first son Julian, and frequently left drugs around the house. And finally, in his 1980 interview with Playboy, Lennon almost casually admitted that he beat his former wife Cynthia Lennon, saying, "I used to be cruel to my woman, and physically, any woman. I was a hitter. That is why I'm always on about peace, you see. It is the most violent people who go for love and peace." Despite being a controversial and complicated figure, John Lennon nonetheless continued to make art and music that not only mobilized generations of young people, but created real change in a world that was ready and in need of it.
Unfortunately, what came next was considered one of the greatest tragedies in the latter half of the 20th century, the day the music died. Again.
In the early evening of December 8, 1980, John Lennon and Yoko Ono left their Upper West Side apartment, the Dakota, to go to the music studio. On their way out, Lennon stopped to give autographs to fans in waiting, including one to a bespectacled man in a rumpled coat. Later that evening, at around 10:45 p.m., John and Yoko returned to the Dakota to say goodnight to their son before heading out to grab a late dinner. Yoko got out of the car first, followed by Lennon. At that moment, the bespectacled man in the rumpled coat re-emerged holding a gun. His name was Mark David Chapman, and in an instant, he shot John Lennon 4 times in the back, killing him. As Yoko Ono grieved the death of her beloved husband, Mark David Chapman pulled out a copy of Catcher in the Rye, which he read while he waited for the police to arrest him. In the meantime, news of John Lennon's death traveled quickly. Fans rushed to the Dakota and nearby Central Park to pay their respects. The whole world mourned the death of this musical legend.
Mark David Chapman pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 20 years to life for his crimes. He claimed he carried out the murder because that's what God wanted. Many felt that Chapman suffered from mental illness, and after his arrest, a psychiatrist even diagnosed him with schizophrenia. He also had delusions of fame, which he felt he could only achieve by killing another famous person. By all accounts, the tragic murder of John Lennon was an open and shut case. Or was it not?
A few conspiracy theories exist surrounding the murder of John Lennon, the most prominent one being that he was a target of assassination by the CIA, and that Mark Chapman was just a puppet.
Yes, a puppet.
According to John Potash, who produced the documentary Drugs as Weapons Against Us, the CIA War on Musicians and Activists, he posits that the CIA's covert project MKUltra, a controversial operation that studied theories of mind control, often by giving unsuspecting and unconsenting participants drugs to study outcomes of their behavior, also used their methods on Mark Chapman, John Lennon's assassin. Within this theory, musician John Lennon was seen as such a powerful threat to the US government's agenda because of his anti-war activism that the CIA programmed Chapman by drugs or hypnosis so he could be influenced to murder John Lennon. Potash points to a CIA document, though as much as 90% of the files related to MKUltra were destroyed before any outside parties could investigate them, that states that one tactic of unconventional warfare against musicians who were inspiring young people to become more politically active was to introduce them to narcotics. By drugging the musicians, they upended their credibility with a more respectable society and sedated them emotionally and physically. Their followers were inspired to use the same drugs and become similarly sedated and distracted from organizing their anti-war or anti-racist activism. Writer A.E. Hochner corroborates this theory. In his book, Blown Away, The Rolling Stones and the Death of the 60s, he writes that in January 1965, MKUltra Assistant Director Robert Lashbrook came to London and instructed his agents to try to distribute acid to as many musicians as they could. Hochner also points out that many musicians did not consent to their first acid trip. For example, John Lennon reportedly did not sign up for his first acid trip. His coffee had been laced with the drug by George Harrison's dentist. Mick Jagger, too, was first given acid by the acid king, David Schneiderman, who has been accused of being an undercover agent for the FBI and MI5 by the Daily Mail.
So where is the connection between Chapman and the CIA? Two things that are seemingly unrelated? Well, buckle up.
In his book, Who Killed John Lennon, British lawyer Fenton Bresler points out that in his interview with Lieutenant Arthur O'Connor, the NYC police officer who questioned Chapman on the night of the murder, he told Bresler that Chapman looked like he could have been programmed. And I know what you're going to make of that word. That was the way he looked, and that was the way he talked. A second officer reportedly also used similar language when describing Chapman that night. Bresler also outlined some very strange disparities, including that when Chapman was 19 years old, he participated in a YMCA exchange program that would take him abroad, applying to stay in Russia and then being located in Beirut. He pointed out that as a teenager, Chapman had become a born-again Christian and was vehemently anti-communist, so it seems unlikely that Russia or Beirut would have been anywhere near his top choices. Therefore, it feeds into a second conspiracy that the YMCA was largely funded and controlled by the CIA, as it was the perfect front for the government agency. The organization had unassuming offices in over 90 countries around the world. Chapman had been highly involved in the YMCA throughout his life, staying at YMCA hostels whenever he traveled. And in 1975, he even worked at a YMCA-sponsored Vietnamese refugee camp in Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. Perhaps it was at the YMCA that Chapman was recruited and put on hold by the CIA until they found the right target. Finally, Bresler also points out that prior to his arrival in New York City to assassinate Lennon, Chapman spent 3 missing days in Chicago, during which his whereabouts were largely unknown. Where was Chapman? With the CIA? In the wings? Waiting?
If this theory sounds crazy to you, that's because it definitely is. But hold your suspension of disbelief with me for a moment and ask yourself, would this be the first time the US government so successfully kept a secret from us? Nixon obviously not included. But seriously, for even though the Chapman CIA conspiracy cannot be proven, it is a well-known fact that John Lennon was closely monitored by the CIA and FBI, and was even threatened with deportation because the US government was suspicious of his anti-war agenda.
After a purported meeting that John Lennon and Yoko Ono had with members of the Chicago 7 and Black Panther Party in 1971, the US government began to see Lennon as a credible threat, not only to the stability of the nation, but to the 1972 election, because John Lennon was attempting to mobilize people against the Nixon administration. According to historian John Wiener, who spent 14 years trying to obtain Lennon's FBI file from the government in a Freedom of Information Act that made it all the way to the Supreme Court, Lennon's FBI file also included a wanted poster that was distributed to police officers around the country, in which the FBI proposed that Lennon should be arrested, if at all possible, on possession of narcotics charges, which would make him more immediately deportable. It also included a note in which Senator Strom Thurmond mentioned that canceling Lennon's visa would neutralize that particular threat. However, John Lennon managed to evade deportation with very powerful legal help. Though he was given an official instruction to leave the country in 1972 and 73, Lennon kept his nose to the ground until he was able to finally obtain citizenship when Gerald Ford assumed office. But perhaps this wasn't enough to keep John Lennon out of harm's way.
So was Mark David Chapman a puppet for the CIA? Or was the death of John Lennon just a shocking, tragic event? An example of mental illness gone unchecked? I don't know. But what I do know is that John Lennon is greatly missed. Though at times flawed, he was a powerful figure whose art not only changed the world, but whose political and philosophical views revolutionized entire generations of people. And apparently he's still pretty influential to this day. Tell me what you think in the comments and if I've missed anything. Otherwise, it's been my pleasure to be your host, Dagula San Vicente Jr. And this has been yet another episode of Hollywood Parallel Universe. Tune in next time for more.